In the high valleys of the Montana Territory, in the autumn of 1888, people saw something that made them pull their wagons to a stop. Elias Thorne was doing something strange to his cabin. He was nailing a lattice of thin poplar poles to his perfectly good log walls. Then he started stuffing the gaps. He wasn't stuffing them with moss or mud. He was stuffing them with heaps of foul-smelling hide scraps, greasy, hair-covered remnants from the valley's tannery, the refuse pile that even the coyotes ignored. People saw a man methodically turning his home into a garbage heap. They thought he'd lost his mind. The valley had a way of dealing with winter. You built thick. You chopped wood. You burned it. Fast. That was the law of the cold. Elias Thorne was breaking it. He was wrapping his house in trash. And when the winter of 1888 hit with a fury that froze mercury in the thermometers, that crazy, stinking hide and hair shell would prove the difference between survival and surrender. It would make men who had built cabins for 40 years question everything they knew. If you want to see the number that made the territory's best builders go silent, stay until the end. What did this quiet ex-tanner understand about heat, hair, and air that every seasoned frontiersman in the valley had missed? Go ahead and hit subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Elias Thorne wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. He was a 42-year-old man from Pennsylvania who knew one thing better than anyone in the territory: animal hides. For 20 years, he'd worked in a commercial tannery back east, a loud, chemical-stinking place that processed thousands of skins a year. He knew the anatomy of a hide. He knew how to split it, how to scrape it, how to turn it into leather. But mostly, he knew what was thrown away. He knew about the tons of hair, the trimmings, the fatty underlayers, the waste. He'd come west with his wife, Sarah, and their 2 young daughters, Clara and June, for the clean air. A doctor's recommendation for Sarah's persistent cough. They bought a small plot with a cabin already on it. By frontier standards, it was more than respectable. 12-inch pine logs, tightly chinked with mud and straw, a solid stone fireplace, and a cast-iron stove. It looked the same as every other cabin in the valley. And that was the problem. Their first winter, the winter of '87, was a brutal lesson. It wasn't just the cold. It was the work of the cold. Elias spent nearly every daylight hour felling, bucking, splitting, and stacking wood. They burned through 6 cords of pine before February. 6 cords. The firebox on the stove glowed red, but the corners of the single room never got above 50 degrees. His daughters, Clara and June, slept in their coats and stocking caps, huddled under a mountain of quilts. Sarah stuffed rags along the baseboards every evening, only to find them frozen stiff by morning. Frost bloomed on the interior walls. A bucket of water left 10 feet from the stove would have a skin of ice on it by dawn. This wasn't living. It was a siege. Elias was a practical man. He watched things, and he noticed something everyone else accepted as fact: wind. Wind didn't just chill the air. It was a thief. On a windy day, he could feel the heat being pulled right through the logs. He'd put his hand on the wall, and it felt colder than the air in the room. He realized the wind was stripping heat directly from the wood itself. The logs were a thermal bridge, conducting the warmth from his stove straight outside. He was trying to heat the entire Montana Territory. That thought nagged at him. Back in the tannery, he remembered the scrap piles. In winter, the center of a 10-foot pile of hairy offcuts would be warm, even steaming. Not from rot, but from trapped heat. He remembered handling a prime winter beaver pelt. The dense underfur wasn't just soft, it was a complex mesh of fibers designed to trap millions of tiny pockets of air. Still air. Still air is one of the best insulators on the planet. A deer doesn't survive a blizzard because its skin is thick. It survives because its hollow winter hair traps a perfect layer of motionless air against its body. The problem wasn't his stove. The problem was his walls. They were solid. They were dense. And they were bleeding heat into every gust of wind. His plan formed slowly, then all at once. It was simple. He wasn't going to build a new house. He was going to give his house a winter coat. A thick, ugly, hairy coat made of the most useless material he could find. An idea so simple and so visually strange that it would make him a laughingstock. But Elias wasn't trying to win a popularity contest. He was a father trying to keep his children warm. The opportunity came in late August. The new owner of the small tannery downriver was clearing out the old waste pits. Years of accumulated trimmings, hair, and fleshing scraps. He was going to bury it. Elias went to see him. "I'll haul it away for you," Elias said. The owner, a man named Henderson, squinted at him. "All of it? It's got to be 4-5 tons of rotten scrap." "I'll take it," Elias repeated. "What in God's name for?" "Filling some low spots on my land." Henderson shrugged. "Fine by me. Saves me a week of digging." For 2 weeks, Elias and his old mule hauled wagon load after wagon load of tannery waste. The smell was overpowering. Sarah held a cloth over her nose when he came near the cabin. The girls watched from the window, confused. He piled it in a great heap 100 yards from the house, a mound of what looked like decomposing animal carcasses. Then the build began. This wasn't a set of instructions from a book. This was instinct, born from 2 decades of handling hides. First, he built the frame. He cut dozens of young, straight poplar saplings, about 3 inches thick. He nailed them vertically to the log walls, every 2 feet. Then he nailed horizontal poles across them, creating a grid that stood about 8 inches off the surface of the cabin. A cage. Now here's what made this actually brilliant. He was creating an 8-inch air gap. This was the first layer of insulation. He explained it to Sarah one evening, using his hands. "The wind can hit the outside of this new wall," he said, "but the air between it and the real wall will stay mostly still, like the dead air in a double-pane window." She nodded, trying to understand, her face a mask of worried patience. Next came the fill. This was the part that made people stare. He took the hide scraps and began to treat them. He wasn't trying to tan them into leather. He was just trying to preserve them and kill the smell. He mixed up a barrel of cheap salt brine and borax he'd bought at the trading post. He soaked the scraps, then laid them out on racks to dry. The process was grueling, messy work. But as they dried, the hides became stiff, and the worst of the odor faded to a musty, earthy smell. Then he started packing. He packed the 8-inch cavity between the lattice and the log wall with the coarsest, hairiest scraps. He packed it tight, forcing it into every crevice. This was the second layer of insulation, the trapped air within the dense mat of hair and skin. Millions of tiny air pockets, just like in a beaver's winter pelt. He was creating a wall that wasn't solid. It was a sponge for heat. He worked steadily, methodically, through September and into October. Neighbors would ride past, slow their horses, and just stare. They'd see Elias, covered in grime and hair, stuffing his walls with refuse. They'd shake their heads and ride on. Once the cavity was filled, he started on the outer layer. He took the largest, flattest pieces of hide and nailed them directly to the poplar lattice, overlapping them like shingles, hair side out. This was the weather shield. The hair would shed rain and snow, protecting the packed insulation behind it. He meticulously sealed every seam with a mixture of pine pitch and ash. His wife, Sarah, watched him from the porch, her arms crossed. She had defended him to the ladies at the quilting circle, but her patience was wearing thin. The cabin looked monstrous. It looked like a giant, shaggy beast hunkered down on their land. "Elias," she said one evening, her voice quiet. The first chill of autumn was in the air. "People are going to think we've lost our minds." Elias didn't stop his work. He just hammered another treated scrap into place. Let them. The final step was ventilation. This was the masterstroke. Elias knew that moisture was the enemy of insulation. If his creation got damp from condensation, it would rot and lose all its thermal value. At the very top of the wall, under the eaves of the roof, and at the very bottom just above the foundation, he cut small, shielded vents. This allowed for a tiny, almost imperceptible flow of air. It would carry away any moisture that migrated from inside the cabin, keeping the hide and hair-filling bone dry. It was a breathable wall, a principle that building science wouldn't formalize for another 70 years. By the end of October, it was done. The cabin was unrecognizable. From the outside, it looked like a barn had eaten a house, a shaggy, brown, brutish-looking structure that seemed more animal than architecture. It didn't have the clean, proud lines of a traditional log cabin. It looked primitive. It looked desperate. Total cost, under $30. The hide scraps were free. The poplar poles he cut himself. The salt, borax, and hardware cost him $27 at the trading post. And when the neighbors saw the finished thing, they didn't see engineering. They saw poverty. They saw failure. The ridicule started before the first snow. It began with Silas Blackwood. Silas ran the sawmill and had built half the cabins in the valley, including the one Elias now lived in. He considered himself an authority on sound construction. He rode out to Elias's place, his face a grim mask of disapproval. He walked around the cabin, poking at the hairy walls with his cane. "Thorn," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "What is this?" "An experiment, Silas," Elias said, his voice level. He was splitting wood for the coming winter. The pile was noticeably smaller than his neighbor's. "It's a fire hazard and a home for vermin," Blackwood declared. "You'll have rats and weasels living in your walls by Christmas, and when that mess gets damp, it'll hold moisture against your logs. You're rotting your own house from the outside in. You've taken a fine, solid cabin, and you've destroyed it." Elias just kept his rhythm with the axe. Thunk, split, thunk, split. "Just trying something different, Silas," he said, not looking up. Blackwood snorted in disgust. "Different isn't always better. Sometimes it's just plain stupid." He mounted his horse and rode off, shaking his head. The story of Silas Blackwood's visit spread through the valley like wildfire. It gave people permission to voice their own scorn. The cruelest insult came from Jed, a local trapper, at the trading post a week later. Elias was there to buy flour. The place was crowded, men warming themselves by the stove. Jed saw him come in and yelled loud enough for everyone to hear, "Well, look what the cat dragged in. It's Thorn. Heard you're so poor, you're wearing your cabin instead of a coat." A wave of cruel laughter filled the small store. Men slapped their knees. Elias felt every eye on him. He didn't react. He walked to the counter, paid for his flour, and walked out. The silence he left behind was almost as loud as the laughter had been. After that, they called it the Hairy Cabin, or Thorn's Folly. The gossip network was relentless. At the church social, women would offer Sarah pitying looks and ask if they needed anything. The conversations would go quiet when she approached a group. Her one friend, Mary, told her what was being said at the quilting circle. They said Elias was lazy, that he'd rather wrap his house in garbage than do the honest work of chopping wood. They said he was putting his family's health at risk. The institutional pressure came next. Mr. Abernathy, the county land agent, paid a visit. He was a man who lived by books and regulations. He walked around the cabin with a clipboard, his face pinched with concern. "Mr. Thorne," he said formally, I've had some reports. This method of construction, this cladding, it isn't in any manual I've ever seen. I have concerns about sanitation, about fire risk. It's salt-cured and pitched, Elias said simply. It's no more a fire risk than a pine log full of resin, and it's dry. Vermin need moisture. Abernathy made a note. Be that as it may, it's highly irregular. I'll have to file a report. He looked at Elias as if he were a puzzle he couldn't solve. Frankly, son, I don't understand why you do this. But the cut that went deepest came from family. Sarah's younger brother Thomas came for a visit from the next valley over. He was a carpenter, a man who respected clean lines and good timber. He saw the cabin and his jaw went slack. That evening, he took Elias aside. His voice was laced with genuine concern, which made it hurt more than any mockery. Elias, he began, struggling for words. Sarah's my sister. I have to ask. What are you doing? People are talking. They're saying you don't know how to provide, that you're either scared of the work or incompetent. Maybe both. He looked at Elias's modest woodpile. They see that stack of wood and they think you're heading for disaster. Elias finally stopped and looked at him. His eyes were steady. I'm not trying to impress anyone, Thomas, he said. His voice was quiet, but hard as iron. I'm trying to keep my family warm. By November, not one person in the valley thought Elias Thorne had solved anything. They thought he'd built a monument to his own stubborn foolishness. They watched his small woodpile and waited for the cold. They waited for him to come asking for help, for extra cordwood, for a place for his family to stay when his experiment failed. They waited to be proven right, to be. Stay with me. Because what happened next didn't just prove Elias Thorne right. It changed how people in that valley thought about survival itself. Then, November came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1888 is still recorded in Montana's climatology archives as one of the most severe in the 20th century. It wasn't a single storm. It was a relentless, grinding siege of Arctic air. It started on December 8th. The thermometer dropped to minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. A week later, December 15th, it hit minus 31. By December 20th, the official reading at the county seat was minus 38 degrees, with wind chills that the old-timers guessed were below minus 70. For 23 consecutive days, the thermometer in the valley never climbed above zero. The snow came with the cold, fine, and dry as sand. It didn't fall so much as it drilled, driven by a wind that never seemed to stop. It scoured the landscape, piling up in monstrous drifts that buried fences and blocked roads. The world shrank to the four walls of a cabin. And inside those walls, a silent crisis was unfolding. The cold was a physical enemy. It found every crack, every poorly chinked log, every loose window frame. The community's suffering was measured in cordwood. The Colby Ranch, one of the biggest in the valley, was burning 2 cords of seasoned oak per month in their main house. And their foreman reported they were barely holding 42 degrees in the living quarters. The Williams family, with a newer, well-built cabin, was burning half a cord a week just to stay above freezing. Their youngest came down with pneumonia. Wood piles that were supposed to last until March were half gone by New Year's. Men grew gaunt and exhausted from the endless cycle of chopping and hauling wood. Their hands cracked and bled. Frostbite was common. Livestock began to die. Cows were found frozen, standing in their sheds. The desperate started burning green wood, which produced more smoke than heat, clogging chimneys with creosote. Some were even said to be burning furniture. This wasn't just hardship. This was a slow-motion disaster. And then people started noticing the Thorne place. It began with the smoke, or rather the lack of it. From every other chimney in the valley, a thick column of smoke poured out day and night, a sign of a stove being fed constantly. From Elias Thorne's chimney, only a thin, lazy wisp of smoke curled into the frozen air. And sometimes, for hours at a time, there was no smoke at all. Jed the trapper was one of the first to ride by. He was checking his lines, a miserable task in the brutal cold. He expected to see Thorne's cabin dark and dead, the family perhaps already fled to a neighbor's. Instead, he saw Elias outside. In his shirt sleeves, he was calmly sharpening an axe, the thin wisp of smoke rising from his chimney behind him. Elias nodded a greeting. Jed was so stunned he just stared, then spurred his horse on, the cruel joke he'd prepared dying in his throat. The mail carrier, who still made his rounds on horseback, told a similar story at the trading post. He'd stopped by Thorne's, expecting a plea for help. Instead, Sarah had answered the door. She wasn't bundled in shawls and coats. She was in a simple house dress, and behind her he saw one of the little girls sitting on the floor, playing with a doll. On the floor. The coldest part of any cabin. The stories were whispers at first. Impossible. He must have some secret stove. He must be burning coal. But the thin smoke told a different story. Coal smoke was black and greasy. This was clean wood smoke. The mystery deepened. The mockery faded, replaced by a grudging, fearful curiosity. Something was happening in that ugly, hairy cabin. Something that didn't make sense. If you're still here, stay with me. Because the number that came out of this cabin didn't just surprise the valley. It defied the laws of winter as they knew them. The breaking point came on December the 23rd. The temperature that morning was minus 41 degrees before the wind. Silas Blackwood, for all his pride, was a decent man at his core. He knew he'd been hard on Thorne. And he knew that a small wood pile, like the one he'd seen in October, would be long gone. He loaded half a cord of his best seasoned birch onto a sledge. A Christmas gift, he told himself, but it was really an act of conscience. He hitched his team and made the slow, cold journey to Thorne's Folly. He pulled up expecting to find a desperate family huddled around a dying fire. He knocked on the heavy plank door. Sarah Thorne opened it. The warmth hit him first. It wasn't a blast from a stove. It was a deep, ambient warmth. It hit him like stepping from January into May. He blinked, his cold, numbed face tingling. Sarah stood there in a simple cotton dress and an apron. No shawl, no coat. Her cheeks were flush with warmth, not fever. "Silas," she said, her voice calm. "Merry Christmas." Behind her, through the cabin opening, Blackwood saw the image that would be burned into his memory for the rest of his life. The two girls, Clara and June, were at the small kitchen table drawing on slates. They were in cotton dresses. Not coats, not blankets, dresses. Elias was sitting in a chair by the unlit stove, cleaning a rifle. Silas was so stunned he could barely speak. He stammered, "Is everything all right? I brought some wood." He gestured toward the sledge. "That's kind of you, Silas," Sarah said, her voice even. This was her moment of agency, her quiet defense of her husband's work. "But we're managing fine. Please, come in out of the cold." He stepped inside. The air was warm and dry. There was no scent of damp or rot, just the faint, pleasant smell of baking bread. He looked at the stove. It was cold. The firebox door was closed. "Your stove is out," he said, stating the obvious. "Elias lets it go out for a few hours in the afternoon," Sarah explained. "It gets too warm in here otherwise." Too warm. The words didn't compute. Blackwood's own house, with its 18-inch logs and two massive fireplaces, was a constant battle to keep above 50 degrees. Elias stood up. He wasn't gloating. His face was as impassive as ever. "We're burning less than a cord a month, Silas. Blackwood stared at him. A cord a month? Elias, people are burning half a cord a week. The Colby Ranch is going through 2 cords a month, and their men are sleeping in shifts to feed the fires. Elias just nodded. He walked over to the wall thermometer. He didn't say a word. He just tapped it. Silas Blackwood, the man who built the valley, walked over to see. He wiped the frost from his eyebrows to see clearly. The mercury sat clearly, undeniably, at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. 68 degrees. Let that sink in for a moment. It was minus 41 degrees outside. That was a temperature difference of 109 degrees. An impossible number. Blackwood had families on his delivery list celebrating if they hit 45. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the interior log wall. It wasn't cold. It wasn't even cool. It felt neutral, like an interior wall in summertime. He walked back to the thermometer, pulling his own expensive pocket thermometer from his coat. He held it up. The mercury slowly, steadily, climbed to match the one on the wall. He wasn't seeing things. It was real. The data, when Elias laid it out, was irrefutable. He had been keeping meticulous records. Dates, exterior and interior temperatures, and fuel consumed. The Colby Ranch, 2 cords of oak per month to hold 42 degrees. The Williams cabin, 1.8 cords of pine per month to hold 48 degrees. Elias Thorne's cabin, 0.8 cords of pine per month to hold 68 degrees. The difference wasn't incremental, it was categorical. Thorne was using less than half the fuel to achieve a temperature 20 degrees warmer. It defied everything Silas Blackwood knew about construction. His entire professional identity was built on the idea that thick, solid timber was the answer to cold. He had sold that idea. He had built that idea. He had defended that idea. He looked at the comfortable room. He looked at the healthy, warm children doing their lessons. He looked at Elias, who stood waiting, not with pride, but with a quiet certainty. Silas Blackwood, the sawmill owner, the valley's premier builder, cleared his throat. He looked Elias Thorne straight in the eye. The words came out quiet, but they landed with the force of a falling tree. "I've been building in this valley for 30 years, he said, and I've been doing it wrong for 30 years. That was the vindication. It wasn't just about being warm. It was about a different quality of life. The children did their schoolwork without shivering. Sarah cooked and sewed in normal clothes. They slept through the night without having to wake up and feed the stove. The system turned winter from something to survive into something to live through. It gave them back their dignity." Word of Blackwood's visit and his admission spread even faster than the ridicule had. It was no longer gossip. It was news. A week later, Mr. Abernathy, the county agent, returned. This time he brought a calibrated thermometer and his official ledger. He conducted his own measurements, his face a study in professional disbelief. He recorded the interior temperature, the exterior temperature, and the fuel consumption. He documented the construction method. The skeptic had become the historian. Elias Thorne's folly was about to go into the official county record. The mockery was over. The questions had just begun. By February, when the great cold finally broke, half the valley knew something impossible was happening inside Thorne's hairy cabin. The other half didn't believe it. But belief follows desperation. The first convert was a man named Arthur Jensen, a small-time rancher with a young family whose cabin was in an exposed, wind-scoured hollow. The winter had almost broken him. He'd lost 3 calves, and his wife had been sick for a month. He came to Elias not with scorn, but with a quiet desperation. "Thorne," he said, hat in his hands, "Blackwood says you figured something out. I need to know what it is. I can't face another winter like this one." Elias didn't lecture. he showed. He walked Jensen around his cabin, peeling back a section of the outer hide to show the packed hair insulation and the air gap. He explained the principle. Still air. A coat for the house. Jensen, a practical man, understood immediately. He couldn't afford to build a full lattice, so Elias helped him design a simpler version. They nailed cheap lumber slats directly to his log walls and stuffed the 4-inch space with tannery scraps that Elias helped him haul. For the outer layer, Jensen used salvaged canvas tarps, which he waterproofed with linseed oil and pitch. It was an uglier, cheaper version of Elias's system. The next winter, Arthur Jensen burned 1.5 cords of wood, total, down from almost 7 the year before. His cabin consistently held 60 degrees. His wife's cough vanished. That was the proof of replicability. It wasn't magic. It was a principle. After that, the idea spread. 7 families built their own versions of the thorn wall that spring, 12 more by the summer. By the following winter, 19 cabins in the valley had a thick, ugly, insulating wrap. They were easy to spot. They were the ones with the thinnest plumes of smoke rising from their chimneys on the coldest days. Mr. Abernathy, the county agent, was true to his word. He wrote a detailed bulletin for the Territorial Extension Service. It was titled, "An Experimental Method for Insulating Log Structures Using Waste Tannery Materials." It included his meticulous measurements from Elias's cabin, comparison data from the Colby and Williams properties, and testimonials from Arthur Jensen. The bulletin, dry and technical as it was, spread the idea to other counties. Variations emerged. Some used sawdust. Some used wool scraps from shearing sheds. The core idea remained the same: a ventilated, insulated overcladding, a winter coat for the house. What Elias Thorne built in 1888 out of refuse and instinct anticipated by nearly a century what building scientists would rediscover and call a rain screen wall with exterior insulation. He'd done it without textbooks or laboratories, using only observation and knowledge from a completely different field. Years later, when his daughters were grown and the hairy cabin was a local legend, a visiting journalist asked him if he was proud of his invention. Elias, then an old man, just shook his head. "This isn't new," he said, his voice as plain and steady as ever. "The beaver knew it, the deer knew it, I just paid attention." The original cabin, periodically maintained, still stands in that valley, a quiet monument to a simple, powerful idea. The frontier didn't reward stubbornness or tradition for their own sake. It didn't care about how things looked or what people thought. It rewarded what worked. It rewarded the quiet competence of a man who listened to the lessons of the natural world and dared to build something different. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? Subscribe for one proven frontier technique every week, and give this video a like if it changed how you think about staying warm. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions of frontier engineering. The characters, names, and specific events are fictionalized for narrative purposes, but the techniques described are based on real historical practices and the timeless principles of thermodynamics.